Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. Why did the police wait 30 years to solve the murder of Marina Koppel? Find out on Murder Mile. Today I'm standing on Chiltern Street in Marylebone, W1. One street east of the Blackout Ripper's favourite pub. 2 streets north of the lobotomy which led a good mother to kill her child. 2 streets south of the slaying of William Raven for a pair of clean underpants. The same street as the last sighting of Renee Hanrahan. And just a few doors down from the cross-eyed assassin. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Running parallel with Baker Street, the home of Sherlock Holmes, sits Chiltern Street. 2 lines of 5- and 6-storey Victorian mansion blocks, made of red bricks, with black wrought iron railings and white windowsills. They're posh, pricey and sought after being so central, but they're incredibly tiny. Every time I walk past, I imagine a 6-foot banker called Tarquin, bent double like a pretzel, simply trying to get into his kitchen. With one arm poking out of his microscopic window, his legs stretching into the hallway, and his arse blocking his 2-inch telly. All so he can spread his hummus without doing himself a mischief. Yet as desirable as these flats are, they also have a horrific history when it comes to malice and murder. On Monday the 8th of August 1994, in an undisclosed flat on the 2nd or 3rd floor of York Mansions, a murder was committed that was so brutal, so frenzied, that not a single surface was left unsullied by blood. The scene was a rabbit's warren of evidence. The police had a likely suspect and his DNA. But why did they wait so long to convict him? My name is Michael, I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 305, Time, Data and Death. To tell her story, we need to travel more than 5,000 miles to the South American country of Colombia. Born in 1955, she was later known as Marina Koppel, but her real name was Luz Marina Gomez. Little is known about her upbringing, her parents or her siblings. But whereas the homeland of Colombia should have been one of the wealthiest countries, being the world's largest producer of emeralds and Arabica beans, but with the 1950s seeing an escalation in corruption, political infighting and armed conflict. It was here that the rich got richer and more powerful, yet the poor only got poorer and weaker. By the 1960s, unemployment was raging and economic growth had stalled. So with criminal gangs and drug cartels, like Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, paying off officials and running rampant as they controlled the country, Colombia descended into a cesspool of crime, being synonymous with drug smuggling, human trafficking, kidnapping, prostitution, slavery, extortion, and executions. It was during the 1970s that Marina got married. She built a home with her husband, and increasing her extended family, who she adored, she had 2 children of her own. For Marina, it was the dream. But how hard must her life have been? As in 1979, aged just 24, being small, just 5 foot tall, and slim, barely 100 pounds. Alone, she lived her life, her husband, her friends, and even her own children, and flew halfway across the world in the hope of making a better life for them by sending some money home. When she arrived, compared to Colombia, Britain's issues were a petty spat in a playgroup. Described as our winter of discontent, that year saw riots and looting. And with the bin men on strike, the streets were strewn with rancid litter, which swathed every city and town in an overpowering pong. As for London, this new world was wet and cold. Lacking fresh fruit, all food seemed to be dripped in grease. And with so few Spanish speakers, so thick were the locals' accents that she couldn't tell if anyone was even English. It was a hard transition, but her personality did most of the heavy lifting. As a woman who was liked and loved by those who knew her, and even those who were only casual acquaintances, it's impossible to wade through all of the platitudes. Everyone said she was extremely bright, highly intelligent and charismatic. She had an abundance of energy for life, and she saw good in her family and all the people she met. She was friendly, vivacious, kind, and she went out of her way to care and help for other people. In 1982, having met and fell in love with David Andrew Koppel, an antiques dealer from Northampton. Although he was 15 years her senior, and the two of them weren't at that point in their relationship, as Marina had been threatened with deportation, they bigamously married just to keep her in the country. She was now a legitimate British citizen, living under the name of Luz Marina Gomez de Koppel. But this wasn't her only name, as she had at least 13 aliases. When she went into the Midland Bank on Baker Street, her cash card was in her original married name of M.L. Gomez, and the locals knew her as Maria, Sandra and Rosita. But as a high-class sex worker who lived and worked in this affluent neighborhood, she sold her services under the names of Angara or Angarita, Spanish names which made her seem more exotic to her middle-class English clients. Unlike many of the seedy stories of the Western sex trade that we've already covered before, Marina wasn't an addict, she wasn't coerced, and she wasn't living in fear of being extorted by a violent gang or a pimp. She was an independent professional woman who since 1987 had sold sex but did everything safely. For 7 years, she'd advertised herself as a Colombian masseuse in the classified ads of local newspapers, listing magazines, and newsagents' windows. She had an address book of her regular clients, usually businessmen. She worked from home, and as far as we know, she didn't have a criminal record. Earning a good living, she worked 5 days a week and was discreet about what she did. She wore the very latest fashions and was always neat and presentable. Her black hair with stylish blonde highlights never had it strand out of place. And to sum up how successful her business was, in 1992, she carried the very latest gadget, an NEC P3 mobile phone. It was the size of a brick, but only the most affluent had one. She did it all so that, one day, she could return to Colombia to her family, and with her head held high, she could see how the years of sacrifice had paid off to give her family the life they deserved. Her son Javier called her the best mother in the world, and he hoped that soon she would come home for good. But it would never happen. On Monday the 1st of August 1994, just 1 week before, Marina had moved into a small flat in York Mansions at 84 Chiltern Street in Marylebone. As a well-presented mansion block with a concierge service, it was the kind of place a well-heeled gentleman could enter without turning any heads. Being secure, its communal door could only be accessed by each flat's intercom. And being surrounded by a courtyard of small flats, anyone who entered Marina's yellow front door could easily be seen by any of the neighbours. Her flat had a small sitting room with a sofa and a coffee table, a tiny kitchen with all of the mod cons, and a bedroom with a double bed. But then, this wasn't her home. This was her workplace. As selling sex Monday to Friday, Marina spent most of her weekends with her husband in Northampton. It was described by police as an unconventional relationship. And although David didn't necessarily approve of it, he accepted it. Monday the 8th of August 1994 was no different to any other day for Marina Koppel. The night before, she met a regular client at a hotel by Heathrow Airport. That evening, dressed in stylish black leggings, a crisp white jacket, high heels and a black shoulder bag, Marina entered a poker tournament at the Victoria Sporting Club Casino on nearby George Street. And although she gambled a little, this was really a business opportunity to meet affluent men who had money to burn. At 4 a.m. she left, but her next movements weren't unpredictable. At 9:30 a.m., on her landing, she met her new neighbour, an elderly lady called Mrs. Miller, for the very first time. They chatted. She was very bright and pleasant. She offered to do my shopping as she had a car, and said that she was tired and was going to bed. Late morning is a frequent customer. She ate her regular breakfast of eggs, bacon and tomato at Blandford's Cafe, a few doors down from her flat at 65 Chiltern Street. And said to be her usual and chatty self, she sat alone enjoying her meal. Between 1:38 p.m. and 1:42 p.m, CCTV captured Marina entering the Midland Bank at 90 Baker Street. She was alone, she was in a good mood, she made a small regular transaction, and she wasn't coerced. Those were the last confirmed sightings of Marina. It's possible she visited her local newsagents called Sherlock Holmes News, said to be on Baker Street, but also possibly on Chiltern Street. And having purchased milk, bread, and maybe updated her cards in the window, being handed a cream-coloured plastic carrier bag of her goods from the owner's son, she headed back to her flat and closed her front door for the very last time. At 2:45 p.m, she called her son Javier in Colombia, being 8:45 a.m. his time. She was happy but tired. She had no plans for the day, and she didn't sound upset or distressed. When she hung up at 3 p.m, that was the last time that he ever heard her voice. And no one had any idea, including Marina, that her life would be in danger. Sometime after 3 p.m, her husband David called her mobile phone, but she didn't pick up. They spoke often and she always called back, but as she didn't, he called her at 5 p.m, getting no reply. Growing concerned as this was unlike her, he called at 7 p.m, 8 p.m, 9 p.m, and by 10 p.m, becoming more worried for her safety, given her success, small stature, and her occupation, he drove the 59 miles south from Northampton to Marylebone and arrived at Chiltern Street at roughly 11 p.m. With no door key and no reply via the intercom, the concierge let the police in to do a welfare check at just before 11:30 p.m. The investigation was led by Detective Superintendent Peter Slade and Detective Inspector John Ryan. With no cameras on the street, the door, or the communal hallway, the police had no idea who had entered York Mansions that day, but with no signs of forced entry, it was clear that the killer had been let in. Neighbours saw no one and heard nothing, except maybe a scream, which could have come from anywhere. Likewise, her windows were locked and her front door hadn't been forced, and with her clients only attending by a pre-arranged appointment made to her mobile phone, in which she always vetted them first and only allowed them entry to the mansion block and her flat if and when she trusted them. Being a typical summer's day, seeing daytime highs of 28 degrees and evening lows of 16, with her heating not on, it was determined she'd been dead for 7 to 9 hours, making her time of death between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. It happened soon after her return, as the plastic carrier bag hadn't been unpacked and it was still in the kitchen. From her front door to the main stairwell, a trail of blood had been dripped as her killer had fled at speed. The blood was hers, and with him said to be saturated in it, it was obvious where he had ran. As her sitting room was untouched, the kitchen had been used just moments prior. The bathroom was where he had failed to clean up, as with the day being sunny, a bloodied man would have stood out as he ran in this busy part of town. But her bedroom was a scene of utter horror and devastation. The bedroom was barely 10 foot square, with a double bed, a side table, a chair, a dresser, and a wardrobe. In the moments before her violent assault, it was clear that consensual sex between a fee-paying client and her chosen prostitute was in the process of taking place. She'd removed her clothes and placed them neatly on a chair. A void existed where he had undressed, and she was wearing black lacy lingerie and expensive stockings, the kind she often wore when she was expecting one of her clients. But something had happened, something violent and brutal. Dr. Ian West, the pathologist who attended the scene, described the attack as frenzied. In court, the jury were shown the crime scene photos, and many gasped as the whole room was drenched in blood. On the floor, wrapped in the saturated sheets from her bed, lay what was determined to be the body of Marina Koppel. It was a savage and sustained attack, which took at least 2 minutes, maybe longer. With a 6-inch kitchen knife, possibly from her own kitchen, her assailant had unleashed a brutal assault without any hint of remorse, only hatred. With blood in her mouth and her esophagus, she'd pleaded and screamed to no avail. And as she writhed in pain and tried to flee, he slashed at her arms and hands as she tried to defend herself. Then he repeatedly stabbed her, in her chest, her back, her neck, and her face. In total, she had been stabbed and slashed more than 140 times. According to the pathologist, the wounds to her neck were more than sufficient to kill her, but stated,
"It was clear he continued to inflict blows on Mrs. Koppel, even after her heart had stopped beating."
The judge stated,
"The terror and pain inflicted on Miss Koppel is difficult to imagine. She was attacked with a knife in her own home when she was at her most vulnerable."
And yet the more frenzied his stabbing became, and the more blooded his hand got, even as his grip slipped from the handle, or he had to swap over owing to the exhaustion of his actions, he didn't stop until she was unrecognizable. This was the unequivocal hatred of a small and well-liked woman. But why? The sex, which had been interrupted, was said to have been transactional, but it wasn't part of the attack. Her diary was missing, but it seemed unlikely that someone would deliberately attack her just to steal that. Likewise, her NEC P3 mobile phone was missing, but costing the equivalent of £1,600 today, it wasn't worth killing her for, and with so few around, it was close to impossible to sell. In fact, the only other item stolen was a rainbow-coloured titanium bangle bought in America, which was said to be worthless. The crime scene was a rabbit's warren of evidence, and yet he had fled the scene heavily blooded, but no one had seen him. A blood-stained blue tablecloth measuring 30 by 30 inches was found under a car in nearby Bicknell Mansions, but the police couldn't determine if that was connected to the murder. And somewhere, the killer had disposed of the knife. A 6-inch single-bladed kitchen knife, with it's impossible to tell if it came from her kitchen, or if he brought it with him, intent on killing her. The man had brutally murdered a defenseless woman. Yet in a crazed moment of panic, when anyone else would have fled without looking back, he stole a Switch credit card. And somehow I even got a PIN number. Over the next 2 days, on 3 separate occasions, he withdrew a small amount of cash from ATM machines in and around the area of St. John's Wood and South Hampstead, just 1 mile north. Detectives quickly ruled out her husband as he was in Northampton during the murder, and he was said to be distraught at losing her. A maniac with a hatred of prostitutes was mooted, but no names ever proved likely. And given that she had a client list of men in powerful and influential positions, it made sense that he would steal her mobile phone, as her killer would have been one of the last men to have called her. The police had no suspect, but oddly, they had enough evidence to convict someone. But who? Initially, they thought he'd left his fingerprints on the cream-coloured plastic carrier bag. But this turned out to have belonged to the owner's son, who had served Marina at Sherlock Holmes News just a few hours before. Having headed to the kitchen, possibly to get a knife to attack her killer had left 2 bloody footmarks of his size 7 feet by the skirting board of the bedroom, but they weren't clear enough to print. And on her ring, as she'd fought back, the gem setting had caught one of his black head hairs. The police were years, if not decades away from being able to accurately profile his DNA. So with no fingerprints, a fuzzy footprint, and head hair, which all they could tell was his blood group and his hair colour. As they didn't have a single witness to her murder, and no obvious suspect, the case stalled. Such a small room had harvested a wealth of damning evidence, and yet it led the police to no one. On the 13th of September 1984, 5 weeks after the murder, Marina was cremated and her remains were thrown back to Colombia to be with her loved ones. Ruled as willful murder, the coroner declared the case as open. And although her family fought to keep the investigation alive, the anguish of never knowing who had murdered his wife led to her husband David's mental and physical decline. And with his family stating he lost the will to live, on the 24th of April 2005, he died never knowing the truth. For a decade, her killer remained a free man, walking the same streets, and no one could convict him. So why did the police wait 30 years to solve her murder? It wasn't laziness or a miscarriage of justice, as sometimes evidence isn't enough. As even though the killer had left a piece of himself literally in his victim's hand, owing to the limitations of that era, to bring a killer to justice, it can take time and data. In 1987, 7 years before Marina's murder, Colin Pitchfork became the first person in Britain to be convicted of rape and murder using his own DNA. It was a new tool for detectives, and it changed the way that evidence was preserved, as even if it couldn't solve a crime today, perhaps it could tomorrow. In 1995, the year after the murder, the National DNA Database was established to store DNA profiles of crime scenes or felons arrested for recordable offences, to help solve crimes by matching profiles. In 1995, it had just a few thousand. By 2005, it had 3.1 million. And today it holds close to 6 million. In 2008, a cold case review subjected the evidence to DNA testing, as the technology and accuracy had come on leaps and bounds in the last decade. The bloody footmarks was the same size as one of the police's likely suspects. But as he wasn't on the database, they had no legal reason to acquire his DNA, as they couldn't prove it was him, even though his fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Again, the case went cold, but it wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the technology to catch up, or for a killer to make a fatal mistake. 2022, 28 years after Marina's murder. A second cold case review was launched. The bagged evidence was taken out of storage, and in laboratory conditions, being subjected to more advanced testing, it matched a profile on the DNA database to a man the police had suspected for decades. In court, the prosecutor, Mr. William Emlyn Jones KC, stated,
you may have little trouble concluding that if those footprints were made in Marina's wet blood, then that can only be because they were left by a killer. Someone who was in that room, barefoot at the time. All these years later, they've been identified. They are the defendant's footprints, and they were made by the sole of his left foot.
In January 2023, police arrested him at his home on Finchley Road in St John's Wood. And although he denied he was responsible, his DNA and his fingerprints were a perfect match, as were his footprints. His downfall began a decade earlier, when on the 14th of September 2013, he was convicted of assaulting his girlfriend, and as a first offence, he was given a 12-month community order and a restraining order. And as required, being arrested for a recordable offence, his DNA profile was added to the database. On the day of the murder, he was nothing more than a client, a lonely man seeking sex. Whether he was a regular customer, or if he'd seen an advert for a Colombian masseuse in the classified ads or in the newsagent's window is unknown. But that day, he called her phone number. He made a last-minute appointment, and being known to her, she let him in via the intercom and her front door. In the bedroom, they undressed as part of this casual transaction, but the sex never took place. At his trial, Mr. Justice Kavanagh stated,
"There is nothing to suggest that you went to the flat with the intention of murdering her. You went to avail yourself of her sexual services. I have a strong suspicion that you killed Miss Koppel because of the shame and embarrassment at your sexual performance."
As being just a 21-year-old student with limited experience of sex, it was his failure, and he blamed her. Having assaulted her, naked and barefoot, he ran into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and in his blistering rage, he unleashed a terrifying attack on Marina, during which, as she flailed in fear, the gemstone setting of her ring caught a tiny hair from his head, and later, a forensics officer bagged it and catalogued it. He took her bracelet for no logical reason, except that maybe it was a present from him. He stole her phone as he was the last man to call her before her death. He disposed of the knife, possibly throwing it into the Regent's Canal as he headed home to St John's Wood. He wasn't noticed by any of the locals, as he was a local himself. And he stole her bank card because, being remorseless, he got greedy. With Marina being a high-class sex worker, police initially suspected that her killer was a wealthy client. But the truth was far from it. Born on the 26th of August 1972 in London, Sandip Patel was then a 21-year-old student who was working in his father's newsagents called Sherlock Holmes News. That afternoon, when Marina brought bread and milk, he handed her those goods in a cream-coloured plastic carrier bag. And as the police expected to find at the crime scene, he left his fingerprints on it. But until his arrest, they had no way to prove that he was her client, and also her killer. On the 31st of January 2024, in Court 1 of the Old Bailey, 51-year-old Sandip Patel pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. Defended by Matthew Sharrod KC, Patel gave no evidence in his defence and was said to have shown no remorse whatsoever. Prosecutor William Jones KC stated,
"It had taken a long time to solve it, but we have the evidence that she had the defendant's hair stuck to the ring she was wearing when she was attacked and killed, and his bare foot was pressed against the skirting board next to her. And that can only be because it was him who had killed her all those years ago."
stabbed more than 140 times in a brutal, vicious and merciless attack.
It was likely to have been triggered by his sexual insecurity.
Having deliberated for 3 hours and 10 minutes, the jury found him guilty of willful murder. Sentenced on Thursday the 15th of February 2024, Patel refused to leave his cell to hear his fate and refused to listen in via video link, which Mr. Justice Kavanagh described as an act of moral cowardice. Summing up, the judge stated,
"The terror and pain you inflicted on Mrs. Koppel is difficult to imagine. You deprived her of many more years of life. No sentence that I pass can compensate her family for their loss."
Sandip Patel was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 19 years before parole is considered. And having already spent 343 days on remand, the earliest he can ever be released is 2042. Marina's son Javier stated,
"It's not easy for me to relive the saddest moment of my life after 29 years. I'm convinced that my mum had a lot of life still to live. It was not her time, and this is very painful. It tears at my very soul. I hope to be able to close this chapter and to remember my mother how she was, the best mother in the world."
In March 2025, Patel appealed his sentence, but this was rejected. Finally, a killer was caught, but even with the best evidence, it still took time and data